I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messengers God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator has sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives. Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. We got a great show for you today. Sitting on my far right is my very good friend and special co-host for today's show was Charlie, and if you tuned in last week, you know all about her, so we're not going to get into that. And sitting in between us is today's guest is Steve Maines, who is an author of some really wonderful books. And we're not going to hold it against him that he dresses better than the host. Just one of them things. You know how authors are. Okay. And Steve is the author of, it's a trilogy. I understand it may even grow beyond the trilogy. It may become a movie or a TV series.
It will eventually, yes.
This great stuff. The first book is Longinus, and it's book 1 of the Merlin Factor. The second book, you're going to help me with again, Myrriddin?
Myrriddin.
I'm going to get that right before the show's over. And that's almost book 2 of the Merlin Factor. Today's prophetic topic is we all adhere to the same source. And this phrase can be found on page 74 of Myrriddin, book 2 of the Merlin Factor, and is contained in the 7th paragraph on that page. The paragraph is small and it reads as follows. Pagan, so-called or not, and I'm going to mess this one up, Baldua? Baldua. He's a character in the book. I know that we all adhere to the same source, the same laws, the same one, no matter what earthly form a given rite might seem to take, said Pretorius.
Mm-hmm.
1 out of 3 ain't bad. Pretorius is another character in the book, and we're going to get to that. Before we do, Steve, tell us about yourself.
Well, I've been writing since I was a child, basically a teenager. I started out as a musician, I should say that first. And I became a composer at about 11 years old. And what I found, though, as much as I loved music and I loved composing, whenever I composed a piece of music, it was telling a story. And it was the soundtrack to the story. And I reached a point where I eventually got more interested in telling the story in a verbal sense than painting the picture with the music, which is fantastic. But it doesn't overtly tell the story that you're seeing in your head. So at a young age, I was about 12 or 13, I started writing short stories. And interestingly enough, it would start out as a music piece in my head, and it would be accompanying the images of a given story. So then I delved deeper into the images and found the story there, and then I started writing it.
So when you were composing music, just for my own enlightenment, as hopefully other people will ask the same question, composition of music is just the music, the notes. It's not the lyrics. So you're not writing songs with it.
Exactly. I mean, that when you're composing music, and now in the modern age, you tend to think of lyrics going along with that because we've kind of moved away from a lot of instrumental type of music. But back in the day, music was strictly instrumental, unless you get into the folksy music of certain indigenous peoples here and there. They had lyrics, but overall, I'm talking compositional music, orchestrated music, in fact, is what I'm talking about when I say composing music. So,
okay.
And I use the phrase, the images, composing it for the images, because that's what I was seeing in my head. So it became a soundtrack, so to speak, to the story that was being told. Only I was the only one that really knew what the story was.
Did you ever see the movie Eddie and the Cruisers?
Oh, a long time ago, yeah.
Remember he said, I'm words, your music?
Yes.
Which I think is a takeoff on the 2 Rooms, Bernie Taupin and Elton John. Mm-hmm. One did one and one did the other. So
right.
You were the music guy and just missing the lyric guy, so to speak.
So to speak, but at the same time, I think instrumental music also tells a story unto itself. And we've gotten to a point in society that we need to be told the story through lyrics. And there's nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, if you really listen to a piece of, I'll use classical music, but you could say the same thing for jazz instrumentals and so on and so forth. There's a thread of a storyline going through the music. The music is hitting emotional highs and lows and telling a story. And I think to a degree in our society, we've kind of lost that innate imaginary ability to tap into the story in a piece of music. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because we're so in a quick gratification, we want to be told what the story is instead of letting the images unfold in our own mind.
I don't think anybody ever gets that kind of training, so to speak. So I think the most we get out of music might be an emotional, kind of those like, what was that guy's name who did the Star Wars music? And
John Williams.
Yeah, John Williams. Yeah, where you get that real powerful,
Right.
Something is about to happen.
Right. Well, there's a few of them out there. I mean, the composer for Braveheart and Titanic, too, James Horner. He's another one that you can just, the emotion that wells up over some of the pieces of music, yes, it accentuates the scene in the story, but you can also listen, it stands on its own. So, and I'm getting a little off track here, but
no, you're not.
The point
there
is
no track.
Well, the feeling is when I started writing, and I mean writing stories, they would always start off with a music theme running through my head, and it would spark the images to start coming rapidly, and then the story would unfold. So I transferred it to the written word instead of the musical storyline.
We've talked about this, that because you started out, your Genesis had a musical underpinning to it, that actually has affected, it's influenced how you write.
Yes.
One of the things I'm always saying, Phil, is that this guy can say in 5 words what it takes me 5 pages to say. And I've always been amazed at his ability to, in a very concentrated amount of words, create this scene and this dynamic, and you're completely sucked into the 3 dimensions of his characters and a handful of words. And when I was sharing this with another person, we were talking about Stephen's book, the person said, very insightful, said, is Stephen a musician? And I said,
wow.
he is. How would you know that? And he said, because musicians have that ability to concentrate their communication. And that's why a lot of musicians, if they do make that transition over to writing, have that skill and that ability. And it's a very lucrative, talented metamorphosis for them.
Yeah, that explains everything. When I used to sing in the shower, the soap used to leave. That's why I make short stories long.
That's funny. But it is true, though. I mean, I see that now. I didn't see it at the beginning. But, I mean, with music, especially with composing orchestrated type music, I mean, you need to know where each instrument belongs without being overblown in that one line. And it's the same thing with storytelling. To overwrite something is not good. To underwrite it is not good. You need to leave a lot of it to the person's imagination as well, so they can create their own imagery with what you're writing about. And I did get that from music. It definitely was a great training ground. So.
And I'll second that, and we'll get into the book in a little bit, but I get a lot of books to read. When I was doing my radio show, when I do this, people send me books, I got to interview them, and they're like me, they make short stories long. I think they want to prove to people what a vocabulary they have, either they're getting paid by the word.
Right.
Right. And it's like that, 40 words, what they could do in, 3 or 4 words.
Right.
And that's what my wife does for me. She does my editing after I've written something, and she fine tunes it. And I don't think that way. But I want to just ask the question. I mean, did you come from a household that was musically oriented? Is this something how did you find out about
What's
this?
interesting is on my mother's side, it was all musicians, performing artists, and so on and so forth.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and on my father's side, all career military. So there was this real interesting mix of free spirit with the discipline of a military mind. I mean, I remember when I was young, my dad used to do the quarter test on the bed.
Oh, right,
Saturday
flipping the
mornings,
quarter,
make sure
it
it's
should bounce.
just perfectly tight. That's right. You flip the quarter, bounce back up. The bed's made properly. All the while, my mother doing a pirouette in the background. And it was my mother that insisted on the kids take music lessons, And I started, well, I actually started on a clarinet. No offense to clarinetists, but I got really bored with it. And I wanted something that was more expressive, and then I started playing the piano at age 8, and just kept going, never looked back.
And I find, music, people who compose music, I forget what movie it was, it really brought it to my attention, where you get to see in 3-dimension sound, so to speak. Like, these instruments are going to make this sound, while this instrument makes this sound, and we bring them together. And to me, that is just like so alien. It's like you were speaking a foreign language to me.
It is a foreign language. You're right. You're absolutely right. It is a foreign language in that sense. Or it's like mathematics in that sense, which to me is a complete foreign language. But you're absolutely right, though. That's what it is. And it's just like any foreign language, just learning it until it becomes basically second nature, and then being able to, in my case, transfer that into the written words. So they're just creative branches of the same tree, same creative tree. So it comes from the same source.
All things come from the same source, but
That's right.
So you started writing. Now the 2 books we're going to get into are about spirituality, philosophy, mysticism. Where does that come from?
That comes from when I was young. My mother was a Mormon. She wasn't a hardcore Mormon, but she wanted us to have some kind of exposure to religion, or spirituality. And I actually attended Mormon church for a while during my childhood, and eventually reached a point where I did not adhere with their beliefs and so on and so forth. But it was a blessing in that it opened my eyes spiritually, and it opened something within me that I became very interested in, and that is my own nature, what I was all about. I began, I guess I was about 17, started studying karate, and the master that I was studying under introduced me to meditation. From there, I started discovering and investigating Eastern mysticism, and I discovered Rosicrucianism, which I became a member of the Rosicrucian Order, AMORC, wonderful organization, which further opened me spiritually, and I just became very interested in the nature of being, period. And when I started writing books especially, I really wanted to have that as an undertone in my writing, even if it wasn't the main focus of the writing per se. And I decided to take that on in story form and tell stories of a person's everyday life, whether he lives now or 2,000 years ago, but also show their spiritual path or unfolding of their investigation of their inner nature.
When you wrote Longinus and Myrriddin, you obviously this influence of exploring consciousness, why are we here, and examining our interaction with this dynamic we call life. When you went to write these books, how did you flesh that out of your protagonist and your antagonist, and how did you pick your characters in a way that I'm imagining they were the best vehicle for supporting that examination?
The only way I can really accurately answer that is that they picked me. In the sense of, when I started writing Longinus especially, and we'll get into what that's about in a minute, but it was clear, I didn't start with Longinus. I started with just some average Joe in his life wanting to investigate spirituality, or just having things happen to him that made certain aspects of that avenue open up. But I found that it wasn't quite working, because I wanted it to be a figure that perhaps wasn't famous, but that was part of a circumstance or event that everyone knew about in an historical sense.
He was recognizable on
recognizable,
some level.
Exactly. So when I discarded the original protagonist I had, I just started looking at different historical events, and of course the time of Christ popped up again and again. But that had been told so many times, that one particular event, that I didn't want to delve into that per se. But then I was in a Catholic church one time, and I was working on a movie, and I looked up, and as a lot of people know, in a Catholic church they have various statues depicting certain aspects of the crucifixion. One of them...
Stations of the cross.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and one of them was the Christ being pulled down from the cross with a wound in his chest. And then I remember the reference to a Roman centurion or a Roman soldier piercing the side of Christ with his spear. And I thought, what happened to that dude? Was my first thought. It's like, now that's an interesting person to look into. And so when I started doing the historical research to this person, I found that he was fitting exactly what I wanted to talk about in the philosophical, spiritual sense, yet he was also an average everyday Joe in his time frame. He was a Roman centurion, had been for basically his whole life, adult life that is, and he was very much into the Roman military machine, a part of that mechanism. And it was his duty. It was just his job to be guarding this prisoner that day on the cross and having to get him down because of certain reasons by a certain time. And I just thought it was a really fascinating protagonist to have tell this story.
And this is Longinus.
And this is Longinus, exactly.
And before we get to, I want to just back up two things. One, you made reference to Rosicrucianism, and I'm not sure everybody who's watching the show knows what that is.
Right.
And that might help flesh out where all the rest of this came from. Can you just give them a brief?
Sure, just briefly. The official title of the organization is AMARC, the Ancient Mystical Order of the Rosy Cross. And they're actually based up in San Jose, and they trace their roots back to 1350 BC to the pharaoh Akhenaten, who was the first pharaoh to believe in a single god, a single deity. Now you see him depicted as worshiping the sun god, and the lay public would think, well, he's paganistic, he's worshiping a physical object. But it's a physical representation of the one source, is what that represented. So in a nutshell, that's basically where they come from, and what they teach is the inner unfoldment of your own eternal nature. And there are various lessons that are given and classes that you can take, and just a wonderful organization in that sense. They're not akin to, a lot of people ask me, well, aren't they a secret society? Yes and no, not really, because anyone can join the Rosicrucians, and they welcome anyone to investigate them and apply to their organization and get their teachings. But they are along the lines of the Masons in the sense that there are rituals involved and so on and so forth for various initiations in the various degrees. But that's all part of the psychology of getting the mindset and opening the mind to the next level of study that you're going to be doing. It's all about the psychology of it. So
you still practice?
Oh yes, I still practice. Yes.
Okay. The other question I had was, while you're writing, do you hear tunes going with this?
Sometimes. Sometimes
So
I
you're
do.
going to score this yourself when it happens?
No, I will not score. It's so interesting you asked this, and this is totally off the cuff here, but I had a dream last night that I was helping to direct Longinus, maybe not directing it myself, even though I've directed a few short things. It's a huge project, but I was helping the person who was composing the music as to exactly what I wanted in certain spots. So it's interesting you bring that up.
Before we get into Longinus, because there's a common thread that's going to run through all the books, and you call the subtitle The Merlin Factor.
Right.
Can you explain to the people what is the Merlin Factor? Where did you come to that? Why did you choose that?
Sure. The Merlin Factor was another one of those phrases that I came up with, wanting to explain, or label at least, what one's inner nature truly is, the eternal spark that we all have within our being. Now, I could have gone the Buddha nature, the Christ factor within. Mm-hmm. I could have used those phrases, but the problem I had with, as beautiful as they are, and we all know what they mean, there's a certain religious connotation to each of them that I didn't want to have in these books. You can't help but think of certain things when you talk about one's Christ nature, or you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, but I wanted something that still had that connotation of labeling that infinite nature that's within us all, where anything is possible. And the word Merlin popped out at me. I'd always been fascinated with wizards and magicians, and the most famous one of all was Merlin. And to me, he represented magic in the sense that magic is just something that we put a label on where other people don't understand the workings of nature and the universe in that sense. So, but he was a symbol of that to me. And the Merlin factor is just that part within each one of us that can be awakened to where we can tap into and have our heart's desire, period. And through the course of each of the books I'm writing, each one of these main characters taps into their own inner Merlin nature, if you will.
Well, that was one of the things that I found, and you have to go to get the book too to get the information, was that for me, love King Arthur, always great fantasy of mine. But Merlin was not a name. Merlin was a title.
Exactly.
And and up until the time I read book 2, I always thought Merlin was just the character's name.
Yeah, most people think that it is a person's name.
Yeah.
And you're right, exactly. And I was kind of surprised at this too through the course of my studies, finding that Merlin was a title. It was a level of achievement within the Druidic echelon of the Celtic society. So, and the reason we think of Merlin from King Arthur's court as being the great wizard he was a great wizard if he did exist, but he was the last of his kind. He was the last Merlin, if you will, of his kind. So that's one of the reasons why we remember him so much and think of him as being named Merlin as opposed to his own name, a separate name, that is.
And then we tie this into the whole Druidic approach to spirituality and life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you study what the Druids were about, which were basically, for those who don't know, the Druids were I would say that they wouldn't call it this, for want of a better phrase, it would be the priestly caste of Celtic society. Now, the Celts lived in Europe pre-Roman times for thousands of years, and they're basically the indigenous people that populated the whole of that continent. We think of it today as Celts being in Britain, mainly, and Ireland and Scotland. And that's mainly because Julius Caesar drove the Celts out of Gaul, which is now France, of course, and he went into part of Britain, but he didn't conquer all of Britain. Yet the rest of the Gaul and the European continent was a subjugated people under Julius Caesar. So there were pockets of Celts left and Druids left on the main continent, but they flourished as they had for thousands of years on the British Isles, which is today, again, why we think of them as being from Britain.
Stonehenge.
Well, exactly, but Stonehenge
the association.
Right, but Stonehenge is not a unique place.
Yeah.
There were Stonehenge type structures all around Europe. Most of them were built of wood back in the time, and not the great stones that we see at Stonehenge. But they dotted the European continent at one time, all over the place. So, but the Druidic philosophy in and of itself is a lot along the lines of what you see today, and as far as, if you want to call it New Thought or New Age, whatever you want to call those phrases, there, believe it or not, is a lot of the common or similarities between the teachings and the way of thinking.
Would it be reasonable to say that Druidic practices are really an outgrowth of ancient shamanism?
Yes. I mean, they go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
What's also really interesting, too, I found during the course of my research, was how similar the societies were in the shamanistic beliefs of the Native American people and the Celts and the Druidic society. Now, obviously, there are going to be differences, but they were very similar, and I just found it really interesting that these things would mesh in today's society.
Same even with Taoism.
Right.
They all have this very same. I think they're all those manifestations of the ancient shaman that, just like you're saying, different regions, kind of subdivided and took on their own little flavor, so to speak.
Right. And at one time too, the Druids in the Celtic society were all not only just across Europe, but down into Asia Minor and so on and so forth. In fact, some scholars think that the modern Hindu religion is an evolutionary outcome of the Druidic culture and Celtic culture, because the Druids didn't keep written records, but if you look at what we do know about their hierarchy, they are virtually identical to the Hindu hierarchy. So it's just very interesting to how everything's so interconnected. On
Did
that
you
level.
enjoy? Go ahead.
I was going to say, what in the whole Druid expression is it that you're most drawn to, or that you wanted to bring out in the books because it explored this meaty concept of why we're here and how we struggle with ourselves to evolve?
Right. Well, what's interesting is and by there I mean the Celts, the Celtic people, their belief system was so strong that there was no distinction between this world and the other world. And what I mean by the other world is we call it the spirit world today. But there was no questioning its existence.
They didn't have a duality.
There was no duality whatsoever.
They embraced it as all one life.
Exactly. And
how handy is that?
There was, you hear people constantly questioning their spiritual beliefs in this day. Well, does it really exist? I don't know. What do you think? There was none of that. Now there might have been one or two people who didn't buy into it per se, but they weren't as intellectual about it as we get. We've gotten trapped in our heads, is what's happened. Where they lived from their heart and their spirit.
It was a real gut reaction to reality.
It was one of the reasons why the Celts were so fierce in battle. And at first, you read Roman historians' accounts of Celts in battle, and they call them these mindless barbarians who just were hell-bent on going into battle, and they didn't care whether they died and so on. It wasn't mindless, it was mindful, because they were so convinced that if they died in this life, they would instantly be reborn in the other world. It was just the cycle of life. And they'd live their life in that world, and then they'd be reborn here. That was a no-brainer. So there was to be no fear.
There was no judgment.
There was no judgment. There's no fear. So that's why they were so fearless in battle, in spite of what Roman historians would write about them. So I found that to be something that we so lack in our society today, that conviction. And that, not just conviction, but living your daily life in that context.
We get our panties in a twist over this all the time.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
And that goes back, and I think Swedenborg addressed this too, but in ancient shamanism, the belief was the spirit that animates the body is partially in this plane of existence and partially in the spirit world. And that was the shamanistic journey. When the pain in the body got too great, the spirit would withdraw into a place where it could no longer be bothered by the pain.
Right.
And then if it got too far away because the pain got too great, the shaman would have to go back and bring it back to the body to reconnect and reanimate the body again. So that's all, I'm here and I'm there and I'm going to always be there and it's here. If I lose it, I'll get it again.
Right.
Yes.
That's exactly right.
And Swedenborg did write about that dual residency.
Yeah.
And you appear to be here, and yet at the same time, according to what you give your attention to, you're either simultaneously in heaven or hell, depending on what you give your attention to. And of course, we're moving along we're moving between heaven and hell all the time.
Right.
And I want to go back to our prophetic topic. We all adhere to the same source, and I'm going to leave the names out because I'll butcher them again. But I wanted you to, I'd like the audience to hear this again. Pagan, so-called or not, I know that we all adhere to the same source, the same laws, the same one, no matter what earthly form a given rite might seem to take. And that, at least in the first two books, was been the underlying theme.
Right.
Because, you take Longinus, who had the beliefs of basically what was Roman spirituality back then, which was Christianity hadn't happened yet. He does this deed, and all of a sudden, the spirit starts to talk to him and guides him to a place where now you start to interact with the Druids, and he starts to get shown how that all works.
And it breaks down his Hellenistic paradigm.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it can't contain it.
Right. And it shatters it. And he goes back and forth within his own mind, as a lot of people do today, as Western society, which was developing at that time, as we were just talking about, constantly questioning his own spirituality, yet he's being confronted with capital T truth. And yes, it comes through the spear as a guide, but it's his own higher self going through the spear, talking to him, urging him on, and so on and so forth.
And you chose to have a rabbi as part of his entourage, as his advisor, which I thought was absolutely brilliant. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, again, too, I mean, this character, Jacoby, is who you're referring to. He is this wonderful little old man in the story. And Longinus ends up surrounding himself with various characters that help him on the path as he's helping them as well. It's a give and take with everybody in your life. And the whole point about the rabbi is that he was a rabbi just in the strict sense of what the definition of that word is, a teacher, basically, and just a teacher of the truths of his faith, yes, but it was also expanded upon in those times. And he was seeing the capital T truth as well. And he knew what Longinus was going through, and that he should listen to this voice within his own being, because it is God talking, or the source, or the one, as I say in the book. And so he was there just to kind of keep Longinus, kind of nudge him on the path and staying on the path, even when Longinus would go 2 or 3 steps forward and then 2 or 3 back, at the same time. So it wasn't so much that he was strictly a rabbi in that sense, but he was from the Jewish faith, yet he was still understanding that it's all from one source.
We all adhere to the same source.
Exactly.
And you keep weaving that theme throughout the first book, and it comes into the second book, and we have some reincarnation thrown in.
Right.
But I mean, then you have Gnosticism, Christianity, and Druid beliefs again, and they're all.
And book 3, I go into Islam. So.
I know. I'm going to get to that one, but yeah, I mean, it's. Is that the message that underlies everything that you want to get out? That's we all have the same source.
Yes.
Let's stop fighting over this stuff.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's what I'm trying to do, and not even on a conscious level per se. It just started happening, and I let it happen as I was writing. The way I write a lot of times, I know everybody writes a little differently, but I have a basic outline, and then I let the story itself take over. And I have ideas that I want to throw in there and that I want to develop as the story goes along. But these certain themes also develop themselves. And from my own studies in philosophy and Rosicrucianism and various other religions and spiritual practices that I've studied, I see the common threads. And it astounds me that in this day and age we still have attitudes that, well, mine's the right way and the only way.
Right.
Or
if you don't come through this doorway, you're not going to make it.
Exactly, and I just don't understand that mentality when, if you trace it and do any kind of research on your own, think for yourself, you'll see the common threads that run through all these things.
People are not encouraged to think for themselves.
Exactly. So when I'm writing these things in the subtext of the story, the reason is to point these things out, and not just to point them out, but to live them. So we all get to a point where you practice whatever path you're on, but understand that it all comes from the same source, and that the commonalities that run through every one of them render the notion that there is only one way completely null and void. I mean, with an infinite God, infinite source, how can there be only one way? Because he, she, it would appear to an infinite variety of people in an infinite variety of way, and every one of those ways is going to be correct.
And that was one of the beauties of the interaction between the characters. Let me butcher this guy's name again. Pretorius?
No, right on the money.
Oh my. Was a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
Yet he was, even in the book they talk about him being more Gnostic than he is Catholic.
Right.
And even the bishop or the cardinal who comes from Rome, I forget the title, it was like, they're okay with him.
Right.
I mean, so there was this whole understanding, and they all seem to be feeding that same, we're all adhere to the same source.
Let me back up. There was a character that I kind of based Pretorius on, Pelagius, I believe, I always mispronounce his name, who was an actual supposed figure at the time of Arthur, who was more Gnostic. He was part of the Catholic Church at the time, but he was more Gnostic at the same time, and he didn't like the direction that the church was going in. He was, if you believe the Arthurian legends, he was around during the time Arthur was a young boy, and he was basically excommunicated eventually and ended up being murdered. But so I was kind of basing Pretorius on that character. Now at this time, the church was still finding its legs, so Constantine is the one that finally put the church on the path it's on now. Because at the time there were all kinds of different versions, all kinds of different books of the so-called New Testament that were in circulation. And the meeting in Constantinople, I forget the exact year, but it was to something like that. It was to get this straight and get the Bible as to we know it today, instead of all these other periphery things. In the context
we did it by
of
popularity contest.
that's
Who votes
exactly
for this
right.
book?
That's exactly
Yeah.
what happened. But what started happening is various priests and people who believed like this Praetorius or Pelagius went to the wayside. They started getting ostracized and so on and so forth because the church was finding its legs in the modern sense. So, and they didn't have room for these other people. So,
what I was sensing was, and tell me, that obviously you're the writer, so my sensing may be totally off base, but it would appear that the non-Catholics had a better understanding of the mementos, so to speak, the relics, than the Catholics did about what they meant, what they symbolized, and what their power was. That bishop, was he a bishop? Was it
Longinus?
Yeah.
Bishop Longinus.
Bishop, yeah. At the end, was starting to see, whoa, this is right. I mean, he was like starting to become converted, so to speak.
Right.
Was that a commentary on Roman Catholic?
Yes and no. I mean, the churches want, at least at that time period, their desire to possess these items were just that. It was their physical remnants of the time of Christ. Now, whether they actually believed that there was power in them or not is not really relevant in the sense that there was political power in these items if other people believed in the power. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So there was that whole dichotomy going on there. But the people that were not Catholic, who actually believed more in the power of these things, also had an understanding that it wasn't the items themselves per se. It was, again, from the one source coming through these things, accentuating your own inner.
And eventually we don't need those items.
Exactly.
So where one group of people were getting to, like the bishop was getting to the first level, which is, oh wow, there's some real power to these
Props.
relics,
Exactly.
exactly.
So, and at the end, I won't give away the end of Myrriddin per se, but he comes to that realization. And it's just, I found that in the research as well, is that there was more political power attached to some of these relics than there was actual belief in a power coming through them. But there were certain elements that still believed that because it touched Christ, there was power in it, period. That's all there is to it. And you talk to people today, and they believe that.
Phil, I got to ask you about, in Myrriddin, because this is one of my favorite scenes in Myrriddin, is the Halloween.
Okay.
Where they're going through the Druid tradition of allowing the dead to come through and speak.
Uh-huh.
You're right.
Yeah, I just was going to ask you, did you have a favorite scene or moment, or did that particularly get you as far as that whole bringing a real culture, participating, everybody in the culture is a shaman on that night.
On that level, right.
And it's a group shamanistic event.
Well, it brings us to the place where, what are the origins of the Halloween?
Right.
Where did they come from, and how have we distorted them over a period of time?
Right. That's exactly right. I mean, in the scene, it's not just the Druids, it's anyone. Any person, any member of the Celtic Society during All Hallows Eve would, if they wanted to, participate in this rite around these bonfires and allow the ancestors to come through for one night, whether it's a night of debauchery or just to talk to the kin and so on and so forth. So, and I do believe this is one of the origins of our Halloween today. I mean, the whole wearing of skeletons and masks and the orientation of death and so on and so forth. So it is kind of a pivotal scene in the book, too.
And there are a number of themes that keep reinforcing that the connectivity between the spirit and the physical world.
Right.
Even the near-death experience, and I don't want to get too deep into this because I want people to read the book,
right.
but, even that was, just again, that constant we're not just sitting in one plane of existence, we're in a couple of planes at least.
At the same time, right.
We could bounce back and forth and move back and forth. And,
Exactly.
And
That's
that
exactly right.
kept coming across.
Right, and with these people, I mean, this was an ongoing thing for them, but it was on this particular evening, once a year, that they were able to do it in a close-knit fashion and in a collective group sense, and allow the ancestors to come through and basically just step aside. And they would go into the other world if they wanted to as well, and do the same thing, only on that side of the veil, so to speak.
One of the themes that kind of, for me, ran through both books is this transformative power of the spirit and the practice of spirituality. I'm assuming that was intentional.
Sure,
You know, again, to just give people because it's really nice. I mean, you know, the two of you are authors. You Shirley, have written a book about just straight up advice. This is, you know.
Right.
And you've written a book that takes that same advice, but puts it in a context that's completely, you know, different delivery mechanism.
This is one of the things that really compelled me about Stephen's books when I read them, is that I saw everything in You Are What You Love, all of those principles, but he did it in a way that was carved out of these characters that you have a great emotional investment in. And they're rich and they're diverse and they're tangible. And, you know, sometimes people don't want to pick up a direct dissemination of information. They don't want to examine their life with that kind of microscopic intensity. But they're much more comfortable with picking up a story that's fictional, that has those same ideas in them, and examining them through somebody else's life and through somebody else's nervous system, and taking it in that way.
Yeah.
And I was really completely just in awe of the way that he took some profound principles. And again, my book, You Are What You Love, almost 400 pages. And he's got the same stuff sandwiched in between characters developing, meeting, getting dressed, having babies, dying, having sex. I forgot to mention, talk about the sex scenes. That's one of my favorite topics about his books, because, you know, these books are about spiritual development, but they've got some enjoyable sex scenes in them.
That's all part of creation, isn't it?
Exactly. But I want to get back to what you were just saying, because it's so true. I mean, one of the statements we talked about last week on the show is you are what you love and you love what you give your attention to. And it was so obvious that these were some of the lessons that Longinus was getting.
Yes.
Myrriddin.
Exactly.
Did I get it right?
Myrriddin.
Myrriddin. I'm getting closer.
You're getting there.
Myrriddin was getting too. What am I giving my attention to? And you could see them at parts. They're starting to really get this lesson, and the characters are starting to, wait a second. If I give this power, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
If I give the opposite power, this is what's going to happen.
And all through the first book, even though it is about a Roman centurion. And so he still is grappling with that lifestyle and that mentality while he's growing on his own spiritual path under the capital T Truth banner. But he still slips back once in a while, as we all do.
As we all do, right.
And so that's, I wanted, when I started the story, yes, I wanted the philosophical and spiritual subtext there, but I wanted him to be someone, and Myrriddin, and all the characters actually, that everyone can identify with on some level, one level or another, and see themselves in. And it's okay to go back and forth, and you know, it's not, you all of a sudden have enlightenment and then you float off
and
somewhere.
you're perfect. Exactly.
Well, I mean, it doesn't really work like that, you know, so.
That's growth.
And
It's
one
growth,
of,
exactly, so.
Exactly. And I want to talk about that growth too, because one of the themes that was coming through now after you get through the second book is that we have what one of my teachers used to call spiritual collectives. We come back with the same group of people, we work together, and how they were starting to see that, oh, this guy is this person, this, you know, and this was that spirit. Was that part of, in your research, part of the Druidic belief system?
Exactly, it was. They had a very strong belief in reincarnation, as I just pointed out, whether it's going into this world, the other world, and then coming back into this world. It was a doctrine of reincarnation. Doctrine's the wrong word, but
and they also believe in families coming back, or groupings coming back.
Grouping as of souls, families, right, of traveling in the same...
Yeah, soul groups.
Soul groups, exactly. And that's, I touch on that in both Longinus and Myrriddin. I don't go into great detail about it just because I imply it, I infer it.
It talks
and
for itself.
And
Yeah.
it talks for itself,
Yes.
exactly. And the same thing will be true of Book 3, too. So,
Well, let's
but
talk
on a
about
different
Book
one.
3.
Sure, sure.
Where, I mean, we started talking about we're getting into the Crusades. At the end of
Right.
the last chapter, we
Right.
get a little
Well, let me
teaser.
back up and say first,
Okay.
Longinus is about the Roman Centurion that pierced the side of Christ with his spear. Myrriddin is a Gaelic derivative, you know what I'm saying?
Derivation.
Yes.
Derivative of the word or name Merlin, okay? And that book is about a young Merlin the magician who finds the spear in the ancient ruins on the Isle of Mystery, supposedly deposited there by Joseph of Arimathea. Book 3 now follows the spear into the Third Crusades, as you pointed out, during the time of a famous Muslim general by the name of Salah ad-Din. And he's a very famous historical figure in the Islamic world. And legend has it that at that time, the Muslim army had a piece of the rood, or OOD, which is a piece of the cross that Jesus was crucified on, and then the spear, and a couple other items as well, perhaps the Holy Grail, which is what the whole quest for the Holy Grail was about, was to go retrieve it back. So the lead character's name is Masood. He was given this, he was a Christian crusader. Liam Arthur Mason is his actual English name, joining the Crusades, but he's captured by the Muslims. And he comes in, one of his buddies, who is also the reincarnation of one of his friends from the previous 2 books, dies almost instantly. Yet he's, Masood comes in contact with the spirit that they have and is able to heal him, bring him back from the dead, basically. Now, I don't want to give too much, I gave a little bit more away at the beginning of it, but that's essentially where the spear ties into the whole thing. Now, I start getting into the whole concept of Islam and Christianity not being that far apart in the book as well, and that it still all comes from the same source. And a lot of the voicing of this comes from the general Salah ad-Din in the book, but a lot of it comes from other characters. Al-Hassan is another one that befriends Masood, and Masood is given a name given to Liam Arthur Mason when he's captured, because they have trouble pronouncing his last name of Mason, or his whole name, so they name him Masood, which is an honorable name in Islamic society. So,
Is he an actual historical character?
Masood is not, but
Okay.
there are, from some of the research I did, there were accounts of letters written by some captured prisoners who Salah ad-Din actually released once he retook Jerusalem. And he was very merciful, and he allowed people, if they wanted to stay, to practice their own religion still. I'd like to think he was quite evolved, more so than some of the Muslims of today that are wreaking all the havoc here. And Islam is a wonderful religion, and it was, back then, I think it was very, they were intellectuals as well as spiritual leaders of their time period. And there are certain aspects of their teachings that were clear that they understood the concept of the one source, and that it all comes from the one source. So again, I'm taking a different vehicle of the storytelling, but it's still the same theme that's running through it. So people can identify with it on those levels.
So I remember correctly, Longinus was actually a name mentioned in some obscure part of one of the Gospels.
Yes.
So I was
Gospel
asking
according
about
to John, I believe it's just, he's not mentioned by name, he's mentioned as a soldier.
By vocation.
By vocation. In one of the lost Gospels, so-called lost books of the New Testament, he's actually mentioned by name.
I knew I'd seen it somewhere.
And it escapes me which one it is right now, but he's actually mentioned by name. And when I started doing the research on him, it was very interesting. I found several accounts of this Roman centurion, what happened to him after the crucifixion. And some had him going up into Gaul studying, kind of along the lines of what I was talking about. Some of the stories had him just living out a normal life, nothing special. Others had him being cursed for what he did to Christ, piercing his side and walking the earth forever until the earth is consumed, as they say. So my book is kind of a conglomeration of a lot of those.
Kind of like The Wandering Jew.
Kind of like,
Yeah.
So
I'm getting the impression, I got to ask the question, you love doing the research.
I do.
I could tell.
It just delving into people's lives of long ago. The more I used to think how separated we are from them, the more I find how similar we are to them. It's just so fascinating. There's nothing from a perspective of a modern day person that didn't have the type perspective back then, 2,000 years ago. The human condition doesn't change that much. We may have different mindsets, obviously, and different values in certain degrees, but then on other levels, the values are exactly the same.
Well, the purpose of created life hasn't changed.
Right.
So, of course, how we respond to things, our struggles, the whole things, elements that make us human,
Right.
and force evolution of some kind in our life, they're going to be pristinely common threads.
Right.
Or give us the opportunity to get to that, again, the topic. We all adhere to the same source. Life is here to give us that opportunity to really grok that. Yes, this is truth.
Yes.
Now what am I going to do with this truth?
Right. But even down to the mundane things, the similarities. There, in some of the research I did, for example, there were letters that were written from mothers and family members of soldiers that were stationed in Britain, wondering the same things that a mother would wonder about her son in Iraq today, for example. You know, one letter was asking, "Are your feet warm enough? I've heard it's cold in Britain. Do you want me to send some wool?" So, and this is year 300 AD. You know, it's the same type thing. So it was just incredibly fascinating. Yes, so I do answer your question. I love the research end of it. It's fun. It's fun.
So you now got book 3, which is originally, I think, what you had, said on the cover of book 1. It was going to be a trilogy.
Exactly.
Sounds like you still want to keep going with this.
It's quite possible. It's quite possible. I'm getting some input, and by input I mean imagery, for a book 4, which still follows the spear, popping up sometime around or just before the French Revolution in France. So we'll see where that goes. We'll see where that goes.
Well, if you need a book 5, I would think the next place it'd pop up is Nazi Germany.
Possibly. Well, exactly. I mean, I know Hitler was trying to get that in the Ark, because the Ark of the Covenant, that was the big Indiana Jones thing. But yes, he was also looking for the spear too. So
I've been constantly nagging him to make it a 4 or 5 book trilogy.
So we'll see. But I actually did start getting some. When she first mentioned that, I was, well, okay, we'll see. And then I started getting some of the imagery. So
it's finding
the gods
you
are talking.
again.
Exactly. Little g gods are talking to me. So
we're going to be running out of time. I know we've been flashing information and book covers on the screen, but why don't we just tell people how they can contact you, how they can get a hold of your books?
Sure. My website is stephenmaines.com. That's Stephen with a V. Maines, MAINES.com. There are, 3 or 4 pages on my website that have each of the book pages too. I would like you to go to the website for no other reason to look at these trailers that we've made for the books. Each book, Longinus and Myrriddin at this point, have these amazing flash animation trailers that we created for each book, and they're only about 2 minutes long.
One of them's
2 minutes long. I think it's Myrriddin's about 2 minutes long. Longinus is about 1.5 minutes.
Yeah.
They're wonderful, if I do say so.
Stunning.
They're great. They're just great. I wrote and directed them. We have this flash animation artist by the name of
Jeff Bedrick.
Jeff Bedrick, that's right, and he just does amazing work. But they play like a movie trailer, so and it will give you more of an idea of what the books are actually about. So. And that's stephenmaines.com. You can order the books on the website as well, or Wishali's website, and purplev.com. You can also order them through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so on and so forth, too. So, and my email address is stephenmaines@hotmail.com if you'd like to drop me a note. So.
And we'll get you back when book 3 is ready?
I would love to.
Wonderful.
And we'll have flashcards with the phonetic pronunciation of the characters' names for you, Phil.
Thank you. I need that help. All the help I can get.
I actually received a note from someone the other day saying, "Thank you so much for the pronunciation guide at the beginning of the book." It's like, it helped so much. But yeah, I know, they're toughy. They are.
Everything's tough. I told you, English was a foreign language in the Bronx.
I think we should just, what's this, what's the Middle Eastern guy that's very evolved? What's his name again?
Salahardin.
Okay, I think we should just call him S.
Yeah. Well, his name actually got broken down, and Saladin is what the Crusaders began calling him. So, but anyway, yes, I would love to come back when that book's
Wonderful.
out, so.
Let me just give a couple quick announcements, and I'll let you have a parting thought. Next week, Vicki Elke, who is the director of the New Mexico Coalition to End the Death Penalty, will be my guest. And even though the state has basically revoked the death penalty, there are still a lot of issues that need to be dealt with. And those of you who know me know that I believe we need to walk our talk, and this is one of those places that most desperately needed to be walked. So tune in next week for that. Anybody who wants to get in touch with me, end of the show, rolling credits, phone number, email address, website. Any questions you may have, any comments you may have, I'd be happy to take them. I'm also a spiritual counselor. I use spirituality to help people heal. We use a little bit of a therapeutic modality, but mostly it's about spirituality. Call me, be happy to set up a session. I do not charge for my services. My services are on a donation basis. God takes care of me, whether it's through you or somebody else, I'm always taken care of. So if I could be of any help to you, it'd be my pleasure, be my service. With that, Steve, parting thought.
I would just like to talk about briefly, these books they're novels of historical fiction. They are not religious in overtone. I'm talking about Longinus and Myrriddin. But they do have the subtext of the spiritual thought and the concept of that we all come from the same source. Every one of the characters in the book, hopefully, you'll be able to see yourself in. So in that sense, it's almost a self-guided road to self-awareness on certain levels. And in that context, I just want to say we're all on the same plane together. You'll see yourself in some of these characters, and perhaps in some of the self-help books that you've read and so on and so forth. As great as they are, these are put in story form, and they're entertaining at the same time, but they're also, I think, they touch on a chord of enlightenment here. And I'm not just saying that because I wrote it. Because these books wrote themselves through me. I'd like to point that out as well. So on that note, I would encourage you to read the books, keep an open mind with it, and enjoy them. I've been told they're a fun ride. So.
They are great.
They are.
I totally, completely recommend you get them. It's one of those books you pick up. They're an easy read. You don't want to put them down till you're done.
Yes.
The one thing I want to just
Very
comment
addicting.
on, you talk about self-help books, but one of the things that we didn't touch on, which is obvious in both of these books, is we always need masters. Somebody's always got to be there to teach us. We can't just get it ourselves. So, for me, these books are introducing us to concepts that we could swallow easily and gently. But don't think because you've read the book you know it all. If it moves you, go find somebody to help you implement
Exactly.
all those things in your life. You're not ready yet just because you've read the book. But read it, you'll love it, you'll have fun with it. And when the movie comes out, you can say, hey, I read that book way back when.
There you go.
So until next week, I thank you all for tuning in. And I'll again read the prophetic topic. We all adhere to the same source. Use it. Learn how to use it. Embrace it. Let it work in your life. And your life will be that much better for it. So thank you all for tuning in. Blessings to you all. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.